Chapter 4, Section 1 of Cup of Gold. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Read by Kurt from Tucson, Arizona. Cup of Gold by John Steinbeck. Panama was a great, lovely city in 1670 when Henry Morgan determined on its destruction. A rich, strong city, and justly called the Cup of Gold. No place in all the raw New World could compare with it in beauty and in wealth. Over a century before, Balboa had come to the shore of a new ocean. He dressed himself in scoured armor and waded into the Pacific until the gentle water washed his thighs. Then, in an oration, he firmly addressed the sea and claimed all lands it broke on for the crown of Spain. He demanded that the water be tractable and loyal, for it was to be the honored private lake of Castile and Aragon. Behind Balboa, on the shore, huddled a small grass village of the Indians, and its name was Panama. In the native tongue, this signified a place of good fishing. When the soldiers of Spain put torch to the litter of huts, and in its place built a new town, they kept the old name, Panama, which is a song. And soon the meaning justified itself, for out of this little town the nets of Spain were flung to the four directions. Predarius carried the nets to the north, and enmeshed the cities of the ancient Mayan race. He was enabled of his fishing to send strangely wrought serpents and frightful images and tiny graven insects, all of gold, to Panama. When there were no more ornaments to gather, when the temples were vacant boxes of stone, then Predarius threw the net of Spain over the people and drove them into the mines under his whips. Pizarro sailed to the southward with horses and armored men, and the powerful Inca nation fell before him. He killed the rulers and ripped the life from the governmental structure. Then diamonds, plates from the temple walls, symbols of the sun and gold, and ceremonial golden shields were shipped to Panama, and Pizarro forced the broken Inca people into the mines with whips. 100 captains led little bands of soldiers to the east and southeast, where the fierce Indians of Darien lived in trees and caves. Here the Spanish men found nose rings and anklets, and god sticks and eagle quills filled with gold. Everything was dumped into sacks and carried on muleback to Panama. When all the graves had been robbed of golden ornaments, even the wild Indians dug in the earth by authority of the whips. The ships of Spain discovered little islands to the westward, in whose shallow bays pearls might be found if only one dived deep enough. And in a little time the dull folk of the islands were jumping into a sea where sharks lived, and bags of pearls found their way to Panama. All the long workings, the craftsmanship in precious things, came at last to Panama, where the melting pots received them like glowing gourmands, and transformed them to thick golden logs. The warehouses were piled high with the sticks of gold, waiting for the treasure fleet to sail for Spain. At times there were bars of silver tiered up in the streets for lack of warehouse room, but they were safe from thievery in their weight. Meanwhile the city grew to be a glorious thing. The wealth of enslaved nations was put to building thousands of fine houses with red roofs and little inset patios where rare secret flowers grew. All the colored arts and comforts of old Europe flew westward to beautify the Panamanian houses at the call of golden lumps. The first Spaniards to invade the country had been cruel, grasping robbers, but also they were soldiers whom no bloody prospect might frighten. Small bands of them captured the New World with little force save spiritual courage. But when the peoples of Nicaragua and Peru and Darien had become gangs of whimpering slaves, when there was no danger any more, a different breed of men came to live in Panama. These were the merchants, keenly decisive when there was a farm to be wrested by law from its owner, or when the price of food was raised for outland colonists, but fearful and cowardly when steel was rattling about on steel. The merchant class soon dominated all the isthmus. Some of the soldiers had died. Others grew restless in security and marched away to new dangerous lands, leaving the battle of foodstuffs and extravagances in the hands of the traders, who doled out flour and wine and gathered in return jewels and bars of gold for their coffers. The merchants combined so that all might charge the same high price for food, and with the profits they built their cedar houses roofed with rosy tiles. They dressed their women in foreign silks, and were followed about in the streets by bands of retaining slaves. A company of Genoese slave dealers came to the city and built a large warehouse for their merchandise. In it were tiers of cages where the black men sat until they were brought into the light to be felt over and bargained for. It was a lovely city, Panama. 2,000 great cedar houses lined its principal streets, and farther from the center were 5,000 smaller dwellings for clerks and messengers and paid soldiers of the king. Clustering in the outskirts were innumerable thatched huts where the slaves were quartered. In the center of the town were 6 churches, 2 convents, and a tall cathedral, all with full gold services and vestments heavy with jewels. Already 2 saints had lived and died in Panama, not major saints perhaps, but of enough importance to make their bones valuable. One whole section of the city was crowded with the houses and stables and barracks of the king. Here 1/10 of all the produce of the land was stored, waiting for the next plate fleet, when it would be carried on donkey back across the isthmus to be loaded on the ship. Panama was supporting the kingdom of Spain, paying for the king's new palaces and wars. Because of the ready money in his treasury, the king gave Panama a seat of dignity. It bore a proud name, the very noble and very loyal city of Panama. Its rank was made equal to that of Cordova and Seville, for did not its officials wear golden chains of office about their necks? And the king granted to the city a resplendent coat of arms, a shield and a field of gold on the left yoke, and on the right 2 caravels and a handful of gray arrows. Above all was the North Star of Discovery, while the lions and castles of the twin Spanish kingdoms circled around the shield. Truly, Panama was one of the greatest cities in the world. The center of the cup of gold was a broad paved plaza with a raised stand in the middle where music was played in the evening. While it played, the people strolled about, proving their positions by those to whom they spoke. The merchant aristocracy was very tender in its pride. A man might argue over the price of flour like a Jew in the daytime, but at night in the plaza he bowed stiffly to acquaintances not so rich as he, and imperceptibly fawned on those richer. They had grown soft in their security. The city was considered impregnable. On one side the sea protected it, and there were no foreign ships on the southern ocean anyway. To the landward side were walls and a broad morass which might be flooded in time of danger, making the city a veritable island. In addition, an attacking army must cut its way through the Isthmian jungle. To approach in force must wind through narrow passages which might easily be defended by a small body of men. No one considered it possible that any sane leader could dream of the conquest of Panama. And so, when Campeche and Portobello and Maracaibo fell to the buccaneers, the merchants of the cup of gold shrugged their shoulders and went about the usual business. It was unfortunate, of course. Indeed, it was sad that their own countrymen should be so used and robbed. But what could they expect? Their cities were on the wrong ocean. Panama need never think of these disturbances except with pity. God was good, and business, well, terrible. No money anymore, and the farmers hanging on to their goods like thieves. Don Juan Perez de Guzman was governor of the Cup of Gold, a quiet nobleman whose life was devoted to being a complete gentleman and nothing else. He drilled his little army, changed his uniforms, and looked with care to the marriages of his relatives. He had been a soldier all his life, not a good campaigner, perhaps, but an extremely gallant officer. The communications he wrote to his subordinates were magnificent. His wording of a demand for surrender by an Indian village was above reproach. The people loved their governor. He dressed so well. He was so proud, yet condescending. They cheered him daily as he clattered down the street with a troop of horse behind him. If there were any apprehension of attack, surely the gallant figure of Don Juan would reassure the people. His were the noblest blood and the richest warehouses in the city. Thus they lived happily in Panama, going to the green country places when the hot days were in, and returning to the balls and receptions of the town during the rainy season. And this was the cup of gold when Henry Morgan determined on its destruction. One day the news crept into Panama that the terrible Morgan was coming in conquest. At first there was amused unbelief, but when more messengers came in, the city roused itself to frantic activity. The people rushed to the churches, confessed, kissed relics, and rushed home again. Hundreds of priests marched in procession bearing the host through the streets. The dark brotherhood fiercely whipped themselves and dragged the heavy cross about for everyone to see. The broken walls went unmended. The rusty cannons were not replaced. Don Juan heard mass after mass, spoke to the frenzied people, and suggested a procession of all the priests in the city. Horrible stories began to grow up. How the buccaneers were not men at all, but animal things with heads like crocodiles and lions' claws. Grave men discussed such possibilities in the streets. The blessing of the day, Don Pedro. The Virgin's blessing, Don Guillermo. What is your thought of these robbers? Ah, horrible, Don Guillermo, horrible. They are said to be demons. But do you think it possible, as I have heard, that Morgan himself has 3 arms and wields a sword in each? Who can say, my friend? The devil has even greater powers than these, surely. Who can tell the limit of the power of evil? It is sacrilegious to consider it. And later, you say you had it of Don Guillermo? Surely he would not tell a questionable thing, a man of his wealth. I repeat only what he said, that Morgan could fire bullets from his fingertips, that he breathed out sulphurous flames. Don Guillermo was certain of it. I must tell my wife of this, Don Pedro. So the tales grew until the people were half mad. Stories of cruelty in other captured cities were recalled, and the merchants who had shrugged before turned pale on remembering. They could not believe, and yet they must believe, for the pirates were already on their way to Chagres, and their stated purpose was the conquest and pillage of the cup of gold. At last, under pressure, Don Juan dragged himself from church long enough to send 500 soldiers for an ambush on the road across the isthmus. A young officer craved audience. "Well, young man," the governor began, "what is your wish?" "If we had bulls, sir, if we had great numbers of wild bulls," the officer cried excitedly. "Get them. Have the whole country scoured for bulls. Let the men gather 1,000 of them. But what are we going to do with them?" "We should stampede them on the enemy, sir." "Marvelous plan. Genius of an officer. Ah, my dear friend, 1,000 bulls? 1,000? I jested. Have them gather 10,000 of the wildest bulls. The governor ordered out his soldiers. 2,000 of the king's troops reviewed them, and then returned to kneel in the cathedral. Don Juan was not afraid of fighting, but, like a prudent general, he was strengthening his secondary defense. Besides, anything that cost as much as the masses he had paid for must have some effect. The first creeping rumor grew to a monster. Quaking citizens began to bury the plate from their houses. The churchmen threw chalices and candlesticks into the cisterns for safety, and walled up their more precious relics in passages underground. Balboa would have strengthened the walls and flooded the approach. Pizarro's army would have been halfway across the isthmus by this to meet the oncoming buccaneers. But those brave times were past. The merchants of Panama thought only of their possessions, their lives, and their souls, in the order named. They never considered belting on swords or toiling at the disintegrated walls. That was for the soldiers of the king, who were paid good money to protect the citizens. The governor must see to the defense. Don Juan had reviewed his troops. That, to his mind, was all any general could do. The uniforms were proof against criticism, and his soldiers would have come with credit through any parade ground in Europe. Meanwhile, another mass would not hurt matters. 1. While the buccaneers were throwing away the savings of plundered Maracaibo, Henry Morgan plunged deeply into plans for his new conquest. It would require more fighting men than had ever before been assembled. The messengers of Captain Morgan went out to the four corners of the Spanish Main. His words found their way to Plymouth and New Amsterdam. Even to the wooded islands where men lived like apes went his invitation to the great pillage. "Every man will be rich if we succeed," so ran the message. "This will be the most powerful blow ever struck by the Brotherhood. We will carry terror to the inmost heart of Spain. Our fleet gathers on the south side of Tortuga by October." And soon the ships and men poured to the place of rendezvous. Enormous new vessels with white sails and carven prows. Ships bristling with brass cannons, old rotting hulks, their bottoms so foul with weeds that they moved through the water like logs. There came sloops and long canoes and flatboats forced through the water with sweeps. Even rafts drew to the meeting place under woven palm sails. And the men, all the blustering brotherhood of Tortuga, the old expert pirates of Goave, Frenchmen, Netherlanders, English, and Portuguese, the embattled outcasts of the world. Canoe loads of slaves who had escaped the Spaniards paddled in, drawn to this expedition by a thirsting for their master's blood. The slaves were Caribs and Negroes and fevered whites. Little groups of hunters appeared on the beaches of jungled islands and took ship for the south side of Tortuga. Among the major ships were tall frigates and galleons which had been captured in old engagements. When the time came for departure, Captain Morgan had 37 ships under his hand, and 2,000 fighting men in addition to the mariners and boys. In the crowd of shipping lay 3 slim, clean sloops from New England. They had not come to fight, but to trade. Powder for plunder, whiskey for gold. Powder and whiskey were the 2 great weapons of offense. And besides, these Plymouth men would buy old useless ships for the iron and cordage they contained. Captain Morgan had sent hunters into the woods to shoot cattle, and ships to the mainland to steal grain. When all returned, there was food on hand for a voyage. No one save Curtigris and Henry Morgan, of all this polyglot press of men who had come at the call of conquest, knew where that conquest was to be. No one dreamed where they would be sailing and whom fighting at the journey's end. The army of brave thieves had trooped to the name of Morgan, thirstily confident in his promise of unlimited plunder. Henry Morgan had not dared to tell his destination. Potent though his name was, the buccaneers would have recoiled from such an impregnable objective. If they were given time to think of Panama, they would run home out of dread, for stories of the power and protection of the cup of gold had been told in all their islands for over half a century. Panama was a cloud city, an eerie, half-unearthly place, and armed with lightnings. Of course there were those who believed the streets paved with golden cobbles, and certain church windows carved from single emeralds. These legends would draw them on, if only they had no time to think of the hazards as well. When the ships had been careened and scraped, all the sails mended, the cannons scoured and tested, the holds filled with foodstuffs, then Henry Morgan called a meeting of his captains for the purpose of signing solemn articles and dividing the fleet into commands. They gathered in the oaken cabin of the admiral, 30 captains who had brought ships to the mission. The frigate of Captain Morgan was a fine Spanish man-of-war. It had been commanded by a duke before it fell into the pirates' hands. The cabin resembled a large drawing room paneled in dark oak, its walls drawing slightly inward at the top. Across the ceiling were heavy beams carved with vines and delicate, slim leaves. On one wall had been the painted arms of Spain, but a dagger had scraped and scratched it nearly out of sight. Captain Morgan sat behind a broad table of which each leg was a curious carved lion, and around him, seated on stools, were the 30 leaders of his fleet and army. They waited impatiently for his communication. There was the short, serious Captain Sawkins, whose eyes burned with the fervor of Puritanism. He justified his murders with Scripture, and offered prayers of thanksgiving from a gun carriage after a successful rape. Black Grippo was there, an old man now, and sagging under his unimportant infamies. He had come finally to regard his God as a patient policeman whom one might possibly outwit. Lately he had reasoned that he might flee his sins by a general confession and reconfirmation in his mother church, and this he intended to do when one more expedition should provide him with a golden candlestick to bear to the confessing priest by way of peace offering. Hulbert and Tegna, Sullivan and Mather sat on stools surrounding Captain Morgan. In a dark corner were 2 whom the whole brotherhood knew as inseparables. They were called simply the Burgundian and the other Burgundian. The first was a little fat man with a face like a red-bloated sun. He was nervous and excitable. The slightest public attention threw him into a fit of embarrassment. When he was spoken to, his face became redder, and he gave the impression of a bug frantically looking for a board under which to hide. His companion, the other Burgundian, was his defender and guide. The other Burgundian was taller and more powerfully made, although his left arm was gone at the elbow. These 2 might have been seen at any time walking together, sitting together. They seldom spoke, but always the good arm of the other Burgundian would be about the shoulders of his dumpy friend in a gesture of protection. Captain Morgan made his voice harsh and cold for his speech. There was a deep silence while he read the articles. A man who brought a ship might draw such and such rent. A carpenter with tools was to be paid so much. Such amounts would be set aside for dependents of the slain. Then he came to the rewards to the first man to sight an enemy, the first to kill a Spaniard, the first into the city. The articles were finished. "Now sign," demanded Captain Morgan, and the men shuffled to the table and inscribed their names or marks. When they were seated again, Sawkins spoke out. "The rewards are 4 times as great as custom demands. Why is that?" Sawkins' training had made him a Boer waist. "The men will need bravery," Henry Morgan said calmly. "They will need urging, for we go to Panama." "Panama!" It was almost a groan that answered him. "Yes, Panama. You have signed articles, and I hang deserters. Look to the spirits of your men. You know something of the wealth of Panama, enough to wet their tongues, and I know the dangers well enough to be sure they are surmountable. But Panama, Sawkins began. I hang deserters, Captain Morgan said, and he left the cabin. Curtigree remained to listen. He would report the temper of the men. There was long silence. Every man was recalling the things he had heard about Panama. It is dangerous, said Sawkins at last. Dangerous, but goodly rich. And the captain swore he knew the plan of the city and all the dangers of the fight. These words brought sudden reassurance. If Captain Morgan knew, then they need not fear. Morgan was infallible. The room filled with nervous, quick conversation. Money? They walk on it. I've heard that the cathedral. But the jungle is impassable. They have good wine in Panama. I tasted some that came from there. And all at once every man seemed to think of the Red Saint. Why, that woman is there, La Santa Roja. Yes, that is right. She is there. Who do you suppose will get her? The captain's not a man for women at all. I think it will be Curtigree here. He is the most favored of us. Well enough. Curtigree is fated to die on the poniard of some man's jealousy. I would not mind killing him, because if I did not, someone else would. No, it might be my dagger. What would you do with a woman like that? A rope's end wouldn't be the thing, I guess. Well, to tell the truth, I have always found those fat doubloons the most perfect instruments of rape. They glitter so. No, but see this. Nearly all women will repurchase their diamonds with their virtue. When you have the second, it is an easy thing to reacquire the first. What does old One-Arm say about it? The other Burgundian. Hey, will you be taking the Red Saint for your fat friend there? The other Burgundian bowed. There would be no need, he said. My friend is very capable. Why, I could tell a tale. He turned to the Burgundian. Have I your permission, Emil? The Burgundian seemed to try to get through the wall, but he did manage a nod. Then I will tell you gentlemen a story, the other Burgundian began. There were 4 friends in Burgundy, 3 who squeezed a little sour milk from the dugs of art, and 1 who had possessions. And there was a lovely girl in Burgundy, beautiful, accomplished, a veritable Circe, most lovely in the country, and the 4 friends all fell in love with this sweet exquisite. Each one gave her the gifts which were most dear to himself. The first folded his soul in a sonnet and laid it at her feet. The second filled a vial with her name, and I, the third, painted the rosy image of her face. Thus did we artists bid for her in all friendliness to one another. But the last of the 4 was the true artist. He was quiet. He was subtle. What an actor! He won her with a superb gesture. He opened his hand, so, and there on the cushion of his palm lay a laughing rose pearl. They were married. Now, soon after this marriage, Delphine gave evidence of greater virtues than anyone had suspected. Not only was this paragon a perfect wife, but she was also the discreet and delightful mistress, not to one, but to all 3 of the husband's friends. And Emil, the husband, did not mind. He loved his friends. Why not? They were his true friends, but poor. Ah, where is a force so blind, so idiotic as public opinion? This time 2 deaths and 1 banishment were born of it. This hydra of a public opinion, consider to yourselves what it did. It forced Emil to challenge his 3 friends. Even then all might have ended with the kiss, the embrace. My honor is whole again, dear friend. If it had not been for Emil's deplorable habit of leaving his rapier point in putrefying meat. 2 of the men died, and I lost my arm. Now here again comes this public opinion like a blundering, powerful ox. Having forced the duels, it forced the victor out of France. Here is Emil beside me, lover, swordsman, artist, landowner. The public opinion. But I have strayed from the tale in my hatred of this force. What I wanted to tell you is that Emil asks no consideration, no quarter at all. I know it appears that a swarm of hungry ants has been feasting on his spirit. But let great beauty be placed before him. Let the red saint be mirrored in those eyes, and you shall see and remember what I say. He is quiet. He is subtle. He is an artist. Where other men cry, virility, force, rape, Emil carries a rose pearl in his pocket as an aphrodisiac. End of Chapter 4, Section 1.